Thank you, Louise, and it's so good to be here. I feel honoured to have been invited to give this brief account of where we've come from, our roots, I guess, as an association of loss and grief practitioners. And as you said, it's now 38 years since the Granville train disaster provided the impetus for the formation of the National Association for Loss and Grief. And it was the first time that a number of individuals and organisations interested in the care of dying and bereaved people came together under one umbrella. Professor Beverly Raphael, a leading Australian and internationally renowned researcher in this field, has always been acknowledged as the mother of this national movement, while Des Tobin, well-known Melbourne funeral director, was dubbed its father. And so I've been in touch with both of those people, and they've sent messages of goodwill to be shared with you tonight. From Des Tobin: I'm delighted to learn of the establishment of the Loss and Grief Practitioners Association and wish the new organisation well. When NALAG formed all those years ago following the Granville rail disaster, it provided a very necessary forum for the loss and grief practitioners of the day, all of whom were working away with little support or knowledge of each other and even less funding. NALAG became the catalyst that helped us become aware of one another, to learn from one another, to share experiences, and above all, to encourage and support one another in what, as we all knew, was and remains a difficult, often lonely, and frequently painful and confronting area in which to work. I hope and trust that LGPA will do likewise and will learn from NALAG's successes and shortcomings and become a vital part of a segment of life that touches us all. And from Beverly Raphael: please send my congratulations and good wishes to all involved in this very important and valuable initiative. And I think it was Beverly who really highlighted the needs of the caregivers, the rescue workers after Granville in particular, and was very conscious of the need for research in this area as well to inform our services and our practices. We also had a message from Colin Murray-Parkes, an eminent researcher in bereavement in the United Kingdom, internationally recognised colleague, and he was brought out by NALAG on a lecture tour in 1980, and he remembers being taken out for dinner by the NALAG committee, and I think they might have got him a bit tiddly because he said, why don't we call this the National Association for Laughing and Giggling? So he remembered that. I've always felt that the broad composition of the first NALAG committee in Victoria was its greatest strength and set the tone for the collaboration across various sectors in later years. I wasn't on that very first committee. I think I came in the next wave. But Helen Goodman, who's here today, and I'd like you to stand up for a moment, Helen, was on that first committee with Des Tobin. And of course, it was a national organisation, so it was the Victorian branch that Helen began to work hard for. There were also representatives from the Compassionate Friends, the founders in Victoria, Lindsay and Margaret Harmer, later Irene Fitzgerald from the Sudden Infant Death Research Foundation, Graham Griffin, who died a few years back, who was a theologian and also an academic from Ormond College. And there was Des, representing the funeral industry, and Catherine Kingsbury, who also sends her good wishes to you tonight, a Churchill Fellow who brought the hospice and palliative care message to Australia in a new form, in a more modern form. And I would like to acknowledge the work of the Mercy Hospice Care Sisters and all the religious orders who did care for the dying and the bereaved, with perhaps little recognition, because the modern hospice movement that Dame Cicely Saunders began, and Cicely Saunders also came out to Australia, and we had, NALAG did host a number of meetings across all those various sectors, so that was significant. And it was Helen who established the first bereavement interest group at the Alfred Hospital while she was chief social worker. And then there was Annie Cantwell Bartle, who interviewed Elizabeth Kubler-Ross for Farrago. at Melbourne University and did the earliest research into the care of dying people with David Dunt with City Mission Hospice. So there were lots and lots of initiatives, but I think the strength was that we worked together and we learned from one another. So I think few people would know that the profits from the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross lecture tour were given to NALAG Victoria for administrative support to employ the very first administrative officer. If I may mention, Chris Hall's wife, Robin Reid, also played a very big part in developing NALAG's credibility, and we had national conferences and regular educational forums and members' evenings. I'd like to give John Allison Monkhouse a sort of a mention, because they actually employed me for 7 years and were very tolerant of all the time that I spent working on sort of issues that were really NALAG issues and community development issues, like getting the Victoria Disaster Plan to include grief counselling and grief support after the Hobble Street shootings and the Queen Street shootings. So as the years went on, the member organisations and members of the committee too began to develop their own organisations. So they began to receive their own funding. So Margaret Noon from Very Special Kids, for example, was able to get her own source of funding for that organisation. So NALAG as a catalyst helped to give birth, I think, to a lot of these services, and then had to sort of step back and watch all the growth. But nevertheless, the umbrella still provided some support and sharing of experiences and resources. And while educational activities were an early NALAG priority, and we had many international and local guests facilitating workshops and speaking at conferences, it was the development of the Centre for Grief Education, later to become the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement, that went on to provide such a solid foundation for our work, ably led by Chris Hall. So what does the future hold for this new umbrella that we've named the Loss and Grief Practitioners Association? I think given the success of our consciousness-raising efforts and service development over the past 3 decades, I think the need for networking and mutual support is still a necessary task and a high priority. As Des reminded us, it's important to be aware of one another, to learn from one another, to share experiences, and above all, to encourage and support one another in what he said was a difficult, often lonely, and frequently painful and confronting area in which to work. And that hasn't changed. I think it's still a challenging area in which to work. So the complexity of the world we live in today continues to challenge us to respond to those who experience grief, loss and trauma with compassion and skill. We also need to practice some form of self-compassion and self-care in order to maintain our sensitivity and commitment. And as I was sorting out the archives, the NALAG archives with Anne and Louise recently, we had it was a hard task. You've done a lot more of it than I have, and I think I only had one go at it, and I'd had enough for a while. I needed a break, because it was a wonderful recognition of many achievements, and yet at the same time there was that sense of loss that you referred to, Louise. But I came across an old national newsletter. This was for the national organisation, and we had WALAG, don't ask me about these names, but WALAG in WA, SARLAG in South Australia. How did we get TARLAG in Queensland? I don't know. QALAG was probably too hard for people. But there were branches in Tasmania, and then we went across the Tasman. We had a branch in New Zealand that was affiliated. It was a very... New South Wales NALAG was always very competitive with Melbourne, with Victorian NALAG. What's new? So just to finish, I wanted to mention just a couple of things from that little treasure, because I remember I wrote some words in the editorial for that 1988 newsletter. Bonds with colleagues in the loss and bereavement field tend to be closer than in other fields of service. Well, that was a big claim, I'm not so sure that Christine would agree. But perhaps bonds with national and international colleagues are even closer, given the infrequent contact in a particularly supportive and social atmosphere. And Chris and I would know that from being members of the International Work Group on Death, Dying and Bereavement, which is a powerful networking opportunity, once again, to learn about best practice, to support and encourage us when we feel that there's not enough recognition. And when I looked through all the plans that we had for the next 10 years, well, we achieved all those goals, and that was very gratifying to see how much had been achieved. But I've closed with these words. We take risks in sharing our experiences and vulnerability. We learn from and support each other at personal and professional levels. But mostly we celebrate our achievements and enjoy our living together. And I'm not sure what I meant by that. I think we're living our lives more creatively and fully in the face of death and grief and loss. So let's plan to do more of that in this new association. And let's not forget the laughing and giggling, because I think that is an important legacy. So thank you all.